everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Saisha. I was a health science first year student in 2025 and I've decided to make these series of videos to kind of help you guys with health science first year and kind of answer any questions and kind of just talk about things that I wish I knew before I studied health science. Actually, what I'm going to be doing in this series of videos is talking about what the year looks like, what each semester would look like, what your week would look like, what the papers are, what you learn in them, kind of what would be the best way to study for each of them, as well as just talking about kind of a daily in my life, how I studied, kind of giving you guys some more tips that might work for you guys. So that's kind of the way that these would flow. I'm gonna make a few parts to these series and hopefully you guys will find these useful. In this video specifically, I'm going to be breaking down the entire health science first year course, 7 core papers, how the kind of semester system works. If you're studying health science first year and you're looking into doing medicine or dentistry or any of the other professional programs, hopefully these videos will be really helpful for you and hopefully be lifesavers. Everybody tends to say that it's intense, but nobody really explains kind of why or how it's intense. Key thing to remember is the content itself is not super hard. It's just the fact that there's a lot of it, and especially if you are someone that wants to get into medicine or dentistry, there's also that sort of external pressure to do really well, to do really well so that you can get into those programs. So those two things combined, so the pace and how much you're doing and kind of what you want to get out of the year is kind of what makes it really intense. Overall, the material that you learn is actually really fun. I really enjoyed learning the stuff that I did, but again, that is kind of what makes it quite pressurized. Health Science First Year, as the name suggests, it's a year-long program. You start about in the middle of February and you would finish kind of at the end of October, start of November, kind of depending when your exams end up being. So that's the entire year. What also happens is instead of like in high school where you would have 4 terms, we have 2 semesters. You have semester 1, which goes from about Feb to June, and then you have semester 2, which goes from about July to November. So that's how it works. And between each semester, you have a mid-semester break, which kind of occurs almost kind of halfway-ish, and it's just like a week to kind of I guess catch up if you're behind on anything. And then that's kind of what happens there. And between semesters, you kind of have a 3 to 4 week long kind of break. So between June and July, you get about a month off as well. So that's kind of what the structure of the university kind of year looks like. This is not specific to health science only. This is kind of just in general what happens. In health science first year, essentially you have 7 core papers. So instead of calling them subjects, like in high school you would have a subject and you would take that for the entire year, instead what we have is we have papers and you take each paper for half a year. So essentially you take 1 paper, 1 semester kind of thing. But you just don't take 1 paper, instead you're allowed to take up to 4 papers. So you can take about 3 to 4 papers each semester of university. With other degrees, obviously, you can pick and choose your papers, you can choose your major, you can choose your minor, but with health science, they have 7 core papers that you need to take if you want to do the professional program. In Sem 1, you have 4, and in Sem 2, you have 3, which gives you room to have an optional 8th paper. In Sem 1, you have 4 core papers. You have Hubs 191, Cells 191, Chem 191 and Physio 191, which pretty much is Physics 191. I'll go into more detail what each of these papers entail later, but this is just kind of a brief overview. And then in Sem 2, you have Hubs 192, Bioc 192, and Pop Health 192, and obviously an optional 8th paper if you would like to take that. You know how in high school you would study something for the entire year and then you would get examined at it at the end of the year? That's not what happens. Instead, what happens is you get examined on the paper at the end of the semester. So for example, the 4 papers like your cells, hubs, chem, and physics, if you did that in Sem 1, you would start learning it in Feb, and then in June you will have your exams and you'll be tested on it. And then it's almost like you can forget what you studied for Sem 2 and kind of start fresh. So that is a good thing. But then the other thing is some of those papers that you take, for example, Bioc, I think it's Bioc and Hubs in Sem 2, they have prerequisites, which means that you essentially need to pass Hubs 191 and I think Cells 191 or Chem 191 to be able to do Bioc and Hubs 192 in the second semester. So there's that aspect to it, and that's because some of the content does carry over, but it's not huge amounts. It's kind of like background level introduction. So for example, let's say in Bioc you talk about amino acids, so it will be quite useful knowing non-polar, polar, acid, base. So that's kind of where the chemistry side of things carries forward. So it's not like you're kind of having to remember everything you learned in the Sem 1 papers and carrying it into Sem 2, but there's just kind of a little bit of background knowledge that is required. So that is essentially what the year would look like. So now what I'll do is I'll quickly talk about the pace of it all. Essentially what happens is each paper that you take has 3 lectures each week. So when you're taking 4 papers in each semester, you end up having about 12 lectures each week, which essentially means you have 12 hours worth of content. For most papers, you have 36 lectures. However, Hubs tends to have like 38 lectures, but essentially what that means is you're kind of learning content for about 12 to 13 weeks. So that's, in a way, if you think about it, you have 36 hours worth of content that you're actually learning, like fresh new content, and obviously you need to have other time to kind of memorize what you've learned. In your lectures are not like a classroom environment. You do not go in there. It's not like the teacher would give you an activity and give you 10 minutes to solve that problem and then discuss in class. That's not what happens. Instead, what happens is you will sit in the lecture theater and the lecturer will just speak non-stop for about 50 minutes. So you have an hour kind of blocked out for each lecture, and that's because the final 10 minutes are useful for obviously changing between classes, but also if you have any questions for the lecturer, that is the time to go ask them. Obviously this is optional, you do not have to. I personally asked a lot of questions, so that was a really useful time for me to just go up to them and be like, so I didn't understand, you talked something about this, I didn't quite understand what you meant, and they'll just kind of briefly re-explain it to you over there. The other thing that you have is you have labs. So pretty much all of the health science papers, the 7 core papers I mean, have labs. And like when you think labs, you think, oh, like working in a laboratory, but like, you know, that's not always the case for all of them. Like for example, for like chemistry and cells, it feels like that because you've got like your microscopes in front of you and all that stuff. But essentially what it is you have 1 lab per paper per fortnight. So you end up having about 5 labs for about each subject. So yeah, that's what happens. And each lab is about 3 hours long. So for example, I would have a Hubs lab every fortnight, 3 hours long. And essentially what labs are useful for is kind of reconsolidating the information that you learned in lectures. You have student helpers, you have lab demonstrators, and all these people that you can ask questions to based on all your lab stuff. Like if you have questions about your lab book, you can ask them, but also any kind of like general like lecture material that you kind of didn't understand, you can also ask them for help. So that's kind of the way labs work. For most papers, they say that the labs are examinable, which they are, but the reason I say that is because a lot of the times the lecture content is actually being used in labs, so it's really good in that way. But sometimes there is also other stuff. They generally don't tend to examine stuff that only came up in labs. Instead, what they tend to do is if it's something that came up both in a lecture and a lab, make sure you really know what you're doing around that topic. Make sure you really understand it, because there's a high chance that it will actually end up in your exam. So for pretty much for each paper, you will have a 3-hour lab associated with it per fortnight. So the key things are, it's the pace. So you have a bunch of lectures, you have labs, you have quizzes. What kind of adds to the intensity and the pressure is kind of this constant feeling of being behind. Like, honestly, the biggest advice I can give to you guys about this in general is do not compare yourself to others. That is the one thing I did not do. I did not really talk to people about my studies. Instead, what I talked to them about were things that I enjoy talking about. So just like talking about a show, talking about a trip that I had, or talking about some YouTube videos, anything but studies, because I just did not want to compare where I was up to with other people, because I knew that would demotivate me, and I just did not want to have that kind of extra kind of constant comparison and pressure added on top of like all my studies. And so that was something I did not do. I guess the biggest kind of takeaway with like the intensity of health science first year is it's not impossible, and I can say this because I've gone through it. It's just a lot of consistent pressure. So if you're expecting that maybe one week you'll slack it off and then you'll pick it up next week, try not to do that. Unless obviously you're sick, then you can't do anything about it, and just try your best to kind of catch up. But generally, if you try that, oh, you know, you would just want to study for a week, you'll catch up next week, it will build onto you really fast.